My ship was failing, oxygen running low when I picked up that distress signal from the asteroid. I thought I'd found rescue. Instead, I found her. Solara, a vampire alien who claimed our fates were already entwined. She said I could save her, but it would cost parts of my soul. I had to choose between certain death in space or this ancient curse that promised salvation through sacrifice. The quiet came first. Not the peaceful kind you get between star systems. This was the heavy silence of a predator waiting to strike. It pressed in on the ether's breath, a weight that gnawed at the ship's systems and the captain's nerves. Every minute, another light on the control panel faded. Life support was gasping. Oxygen dipped below 14%. There were no maydays to send, no rescue routes to plot, just the slow, certain drift toward an ending no one would ever find. Then a sound, a single repeating pulse cut through the dead air. It wasn't structured like any distress call Ethan had ever heard. No coordinates, no identification markers, just a raw, rhythmic signal, steady as a heartbeat. It felt ancient. Not a cry for help, a lure, a siren song rendered in cold binary, broadcasting from a chunk of rock spinning in the void. You'd think a seasoned pilot would know better. Deep space psychology is clear on this. Desperation rewires the brain. It makes you see salvation in static, hope in noise. Your own fear starts writing the script. That signal wasn't offering rescue. It was offering an alternative to dying alone. And when your oxygen sits at 12%, alternatives start to look pretty good. Every instinct told him to ignore it. Turn the ship. Preserve power. Wait. But waiting was just a slower version of the same end. That signal, though, it had a pull. A gravitational certainty. It felt less like a chance and more like a summons. The kind of call that wasn't asking. The ether's breath shifted course. Thrusters burned the last reserves of fuel. The asteroid grew in the viewport, a jagged dark shape against the starfield. No lights, no signs of structure, just that pulsing signal, steady as a metronome counting down to something. He didn't know it yet, but that signal wasn't a cry for help. It was a beacon of hunger. A trap set centuries ago, waiting for someone exactly like him. Lonely, running on fumes, willing to bet his life on a ghost in the machine. It had been waiting in the silence, patient as a tomb. He set a course for the source, not knowing he was answering a call that had been waiting centuries for him. The landing gear scraped against what should have been rock, but felt like something else entirely. It wasn't a natural surface. The sound wasn't the familiar crunch of mineral deposit or ice. It was the groan of old stone, carved and placed by design. Architecture. As the ship settled, the external lights cut across the surface, revealing lines too straight, angles too deliberate. Obelisks stood like broken teeth against the starfield. Arches curved into darkness, their purpose long lost. This wasn't an asteroid. It was a grave. A shattered monument adrift in the void. The airlock hissed open. A wave of atmosphere washed into the ship, and Ethan took his first breath of alien air. It was breathable. The scanners confirmed it. But it was wrong. It carried the sharp smell of ozone, the dry dust of ages, and something else underneath. Something metallic. It clung to the back of his throat, like the scent of old blood and oxidized copper. It was the smell of a place that hadn't seen life in a very long time. He stepped out onto the carved stone. The ruin stretched away into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The feeling was immediate and deep. It wasn't just fear. It was a crawling sense of wrongness, as if the geometry of the place itself was arguing with his human brain. The pillars and broken walls suggested a scale meant for something grand, something sacred. It felt like walking through the skeleton of a cathedral, built for a god who had walked away from its congregation centuries ago. Every shadow didn't just hide things. It suggested shapes that shouldn't exist, angles that defied a straightforward glance. Archaeologists talk about this feeling when studying structures from lost cultures. That deep primal unease, the uncanny valley of architecture. When a place is familiar enough to recognize as built, but so alien in its design that it triggers a subconscious alarm. Your mind knows this was made by intelligence, but not your kind of intelligence. Not a human hand. It whispers of different bones, different thoughts, a different relationship to space and time. That's what this was. A whisper in stone. He moved deeper, his bootsteps echoing in a way that felt disrespectful. He'd expected a crashed ship. A stranded crew huddled around a failing beacon. He found only the silence. And the symbols. They were carved everywhere. Flowing script that looked like nothing from any human database. They curved around doorways, climbed the sides of pillars, glowed with a faint captured light in the deeper recesses. They were a language. A story he couldn't read, telling a history he couldn't understand. He was looking at a wall of these symbols, trying to find a pattern, when a voice cut through the silence. It didn't come from a direction. It vibrated in the air around him, in the stone under his feet. "You are human?" The voice was flat, ancient. It held no curiosity, only a cold assessing certainty. "Then you are already dead. Or you will be. The only question is how." Why would that be her first thought? Her immediate assumption? Because only a human would be this foolish. Only a creature with such a brutally short, desperate lifespan would ignore every warning sign and fly straight into a trap this obvious. A long-lived species would have calculated the odds, seen the statistical improbability of a random rescue, and turned back. A human sees a 1 in a million chance and thinks, "Those are my kind of odds." Our fatal flaw isn't a lack of intelligence. It's a surplus of hope in all the wrong places, and then she was there, not emerging from a doorway or stepping from the shadows. She was just present. One moment the space was empty. The next she occupied it, as if the darkness itself had drawn together, condensing into her form. The words weren't a greeting. They were a verdict delivered from the shadows. Solara stood there, her form half concealed by the shifting darkness of the chamber. Her skin didn't just look pale. It held the cold, faint light of a distant neutron star, and her eyes, they didn't reflect the dim glow of his suit lamps. They swallowed it. They were voids, points of absolute absorption in a face that seemed carved from ancient ice. Her voice didn't travel through the air like sound should. It bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly in the bones of his skull, a low frequency that felt more like pressure than noise. "You are human?" she said, each word measured and cold. "Then you are already dead. Or you will be. The only question is how." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat certainty of a star listing its chemical composition. There was no malice in it, just a brutal, simple truth. She didn't move like a person. When she shifted her weight, it wasn't a step so much as a reconfiguration of presence. She was more like a magnetic field than a being, an invisible force that pulled the space around her into a new alignment, compelling and inevitable. You didn't watch her move. You felt the shift in the room's equilibrium. Every first contact protocol ever written is built on a foundation of mutual curiosity. The assumption is that two intelligent species meeting for the first time will share a desire for knowledge, for exchange. There are guidelines for greetings, for establishing peaceful intent, for slow, careful dialogue. They never planned for this. For one party to look at the other and immediately calmly announce their expiration date. That kind of fatalistic certainty isn't in the manuals. It belongs to older, darker stories. She claimed their meeting wasn't chance. It wasn't luck or accident. She called it calculus, a precise equation written across light years and centuries with variables of entropy, probability, and desperation. He was a term in that equation, a known quantity. His species, his situation, his dwindling oxygen, all of it had been factored in. She called it fate, but it sounded more like a trap that had been patiently waiting for its specific trigger. The curse that bound her to this place wasn't some ethereal spell. It was a sentence, a juridical decree passed by her own people, their judgment made physical, written into the very stones that surrounded them. The carvings on the walls weren't decoration or history. They were the literal text of her imprisonment, each symbol a clause of her confinement, each line a chain she could not break. She wasn't just stuck here. She was filed here, archived, a living record of a crime and its punishment. To understand the prison, he had to first understand the crime. And her crime was a refusal to obey. Solara was not always a prisoner. She was a monument, a living relic. In a culture that measured time in millennia, she was a guardian. Her purpose was eternal, her role defined by laws so sacred they were woven into the fundamental fabric of her people's reality. They weren't rules to be debated. They were axioms, as fixed and immutable as the orbits of planets. She was the keeper of that order, the custodian of a balance that demanded absolute obedience. But a law is a chain, and even a goddess can chafe at a chain. The most sacred of these laws demanded a perpetual sacrifice, a regular offering of life force from sentient beings to maintain what her people called cosmic equilibrium. It was the price of their stability, the fuel for their civilization. To them, it was a necessary transaction, a brutal, clean piece of mathematics that guaranteed their continued existence. Order through attrition. Her people saw this rigid system as the pinnacle of order, a perfect self-sustaining machine. She came to see it as tyranny. They praised the devotion of their guardians, the unwavering commitment to the great balance. She felt the bars of a cage. The duty was a weight that grew heavier with each cycle, each ritual that drained the light from another living thing. It wasn't devotion. It was compliance in a system built on consumption. Anthropological studies on Earth show this isn't a new story. Societies often deify individuals, elevate them to a status of immense power and reverence, only to use that status to strictly control them. It creates a paradox. The worshipped entity becomes the most imprisoned. Their divinity is the very thing that locks them into a role, a set of expectations they can never violate. The Gungauda you are placed on the pedestal, the farther you have to fall. Solara was the ultimate expression of that, a goddess in a gilded cage, expected to preside over a slaughter she could no longer justify. Her defiance wasn't a rebellion born of anger or a desire for chaos. It was a choice, a simple, stark decision for life over dogma. She refused to perform the next sacrifice. She stood before the ritual chamber and simply said no. This act of preservation, this choice to value a single life, was the one thing her culture could not comprehend. It was the ultimate heresy. For placing one life above the eternal law, she was branded a monster, a dangerous aberration. Her own people betrayed her because they worshipped her power but feared her autonomy. They revered the idea of her, the perfect, obedient guardian. But the moment she displayed a will of her own, she became a threat to the entire system. They couldn't kill a goddess, so they did the next best thing. They entombed the thing they revered. They built a prison to hold the power they were afraid to destroy, ensuring it could never challenge their dogma again. They preserved their monster in a cage of stone and magic. The punishment was exile. But exile alone wasn't enough for a being of her nature. They had to make sure she could never come back. Solara didn't ask for his help. She presented him with a math problem, a simple clean exchange rate. She pointed to a central glyph on the wall, its lines deeper and more complex than the others. It pulsed with a slow, patient light. "The first seal requires an offering," she said, her voice devoid of plea or persuasion. It was a flat statement of cost. "Your energy, your essence. It will consume a part of you, binding it to this place forever." The words hung in the metallic air. Salvation through sacrifice. But the salvation was hers. The sacrifice was his. He would get her one step closer to freedom. In return, he would leave a piece of himself behind, woven permanently into the prison's stone. It wasn't a transaction. A transaction implies a good or service for a price. This was a transfusion. He wouldn't be paying for something. He would be giving his blood to the stone. His life, his vitality, siphoned directly into the curse's architecture. This first offering was just the initial payment. The first of three. Each seal would demand a deeper, more fundamental part of his soul. The first might be stamina, the raw energy of his body. The second could be memory, the fabric of his past. The third would be the core, the thing that made him Ethan. The cost was his life essence, irrevocably given, a piece at a time. High-stakes decision-making under duress often narrows the field of choice. It doesn't present you with a good option and a bad option. It presents you with two terrible outcomes and asks which flavor of hell you prefer. Die slowly alone in the dark of your ship, your oxygen bleeding into the void, or die by inches here in this ruined tomb, your very soul fed to an ancient machine. One death was passive, a slow fade to black. The other was active, a conscious choice to be unmade. The choice wasn't between life and death. It was between two different kinds of death. He looked from the glyph to her pale, impassive face. There was no reassurance there. No promise that the sacrifice would be worth it. Only the stark reality of the equation. He could feel the faint drain of the prison even now, a subtle pulling at the edges of his consciousness. That was the passive feed. This would be active, a directed, deliberate transfer. He raised his hand. The air around the glyph seemed to thicken, to hum with a low anticipation. The stone didn't feel cold anymore. It felt hungry. He placed his palm flat against the central glyph. The choice was made. The moment his skin touched the carved lines, he understood. The cost wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't symbolic. It was a physical law, as real and violent as a breach in his ship's hull. The stone was not just rock. It was a mouth. And it was now open. The cold fire erupted from the glyph the moment his palm made contact. It didn't burn. It wasn't that kind of heat. This was a deep, invasive cold that crawled up his arm, moving against the flow of his blood. It wasn't attacking his skin or muscles. It was pulling something out from the core of him, a draining sensation, precise and surgical, like a needle finding a vein you never knew you had. There was no anesthesia for this, no way to numb the feeling of your own essence being drawn out. He could feel it happening, a hollowing out. It was the strangest kind of pain. Not a sharp sting or a dull ache, but a profound sense of loss occurring in real time. It felt like watching warmth and strength, things he had always taken for granted as just part of being alive, being siphoned away, pulled into the ancient hungry stone. A memory of what it felt like to be whole began to fade, replaced by a growing emptiness. It was the feeling of watching your own blood pour out onto the ground, a vital part of you leaving but knowing it's not blood. It's something more fundamental. It's the you behind your thoughts, the energy that animates the machine, the part that makes you you. And it was flowing out of him into the carvings, feeding the very thing that held her. The human nervous system has no specific receptors for soul loss. The brain has to interpret it with the tools it has, so it translates the metaphysical theft into a language it understands. Raw, physical pain, a deep, bone-deep ache, coupled with a fatigue so total it feels like the gravity in the room has tripled. Solara mirrored the act. Her own power, a pale silvery energy, flowed from her outstretched hand to the stone, guiding the transfer. But it was just a guide, a conductor for the symphony. The music, the energy itself was all his. The cost was his alone. She was showing the path, but he was paying the toll with his own life's currency. The ritual acts as a metaphysical siphon. A direct line was established between his vital energy and the curse's structure. His life force wasn't just being taken, it was being woven into the fabric of the prison, becoming a permanent part of its equation. He was weakening the seal by reinforcing the wall with pieces of himself. A paradoxical, brutal piece of engineering. When it was over, the first seal was broken. The central glyph on the wall darkened, its light absorbed, its hunger sated. The cold fire receded from his arm, leaving behind a deep, trembling numbness, a void where something had been. He slumped against the wall, his legs unable to hold his weight, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt lighter, emptier. A part of Ethan was gone. Not misplaced, not forgotten, extracted and bound to the stone forever. A permanent donor to a curse he still didn't fully understand. The hollow feeling didn't fade. It just became the new normal. A baseline of loss he would now have to carry forward. She led him deeper into the ruins, away from the landing site and into a chamber that felt less like a room and more like the inside of a machine. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling in intricate flowing script. The symbols pulsed with a faint internal light, a slow and rhythmic glow that made the stone seem alive. This wasn't just writing. It was the language of her curse. "They carved my sentence here," she said, her voice a low hum that matched the light's rhythm. Each symbol a clause, each clause a chain. The light seemed to quicken as she spoke, as if hearing its own story. Ethan reached out not to touch, but to feel the energy radiating from the stone. It wasn't warm. It was a dry, static chill. The carvings weren't inert markings. They felt like watching a predator sleep. You could see the slow, steady breath, the occasional twitch of a muscle. You knew it was resting, but you also knew with absolute certainty that it could wake up and feed at any moment. The entire chamber was a loaded weapon, and he was standing in its sight. The concept of binding magic or advanced technology often circles back to a fundamental principle. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred. Her prison wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a system, a self-sustaining mechanism that required a constant input to maintain its output. To keep a being of her power contained, the cage itself had to be powerful, and power has to come from somewhere. The curse was a living thing, sustained by a terrible, precise balance. To keep her contained, it needed to consume. It ran on a fuel no different from the rituals she had refused to perform. This was the sacred law she had defied, the one that branded her as a heretic, a mandate demanding the perpetual sacrifice of innocent lives to maintain what her people called cosmic balance. It was a brutal equation, Sustained existence required regular scheduled death. She looked at that math and found it monstrous. Her crime was a refusal to uphold a balance built on slaughter. She chose a single conscience over an eternity of complicity. For that, she was given a prison that embodied the very principle she rejected. A cage that could only exist by draining the life from others. And now the mechanism was hungry again. It had been centuries since it last fed. The pulse that lured him in wasn't a call for help. It was a dinner bell, a signal that the system's reserves were critically low and required a new energy source. He had flown right into the open mouth of it. His presence, his living energy, was the only thing on the menu. The trap had been set long ago, and he had walked into it with his eyes wide open, guided by his own desperation. He wasn't a rescuer. He was the next course. The curse didn't just bind, it fed. And Ethan was on the menu. Solara's explanation stripped away the last of the mystery. The prison wasn't a static thing. It was a system. A living engine with one simple, brutal rule. It ran on life force. The raw energy of living beings. That's what sustained the walls, the symbols, the very air that kept her trapped. Intruders like him didn't set off alarms. They triggered a feeding. The moment he stepped onto the stone, the mechanism woke up. Those glowing symbols on the walls weren't just for show. They were conduits. They began siphoning his vitality, pulling it directly from him to reinforce the walls of her cage. The stronger the visitor, the stronger the prison became. A perfect, cruel design. It made escape physically impossible. Any attempt to break out only made the bars thicker. It was a parasitic system, a closed loop where the food made its own container. The only thing that grew weaker was the meal. Ethan could already feel it. A low-grade drain, a subtle fatigue that wasn't just in his muscles. It felt deeper. Like a battery slowly discharging, theoretical physics on Earth plays with ideas of consciousness as a form of energy, of quantum states and information transfer. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't a transfer of particles or data. This was metaphysical predation, a direct tap into the source of what made him a living thing. His presence was already making the prison stronger. Each breath he took, each beat of his heart, was converted into pure binding energy, poured right back into the stones that held her. His only way out was to break the system. But to break it, he had to fight it. And to fight it, he had to give it more power. A beautiful, impossible paradox. He was both the lock and the key, and using one canceled out the other. The ancient symbols feed on intruders because they are metaphysical batteries. They don't just record the curse, they power it. They convert a living soul into the raw energy required to sustain the curse in perpetuity. It's a self-perpetuating punishment. The sentence isn't just to be imprisoned. It's to be the fuel for your own cage over and over, as long as visitors are foolish or desperate enough to answer the call. To break the cage, he would have to feed it himself, willingly, a bite at a time. Ethan slumped against the wall, his body shaking from the aftershock of the ritual. The emptiness inside him felt like a new permanent organ. He looked up, expecting to see the same impassive goddess who had just guided his draining. But something had shifted. The magnetic compulsion that had surrounded Solara was gone. Her posture, once rigid and imposing, had softened. The aura of ancient power receded, leaving behind something quieter, more human. The goddess was gone. Only the woman remained. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost its vibrational edge. The sound no longer rattled his bones. It was just a voice now, thin and worn. "I have not spoken to another being in 300 of your years," she said. The words were simple, a statement of fact, but they carried a weight that made the cold stone around them feel heavier. "The silence here is its own prison." It wasn't a complaint. It was a confession. The admission hung in the metallic air, more revealing than any display of power. Her loneliness wasn't a sentiment. It wasn't a feeling she could chase away with a distraction. It was a physical fact as palpable as the cold stone under his hands. It was the taste of the air, the texture of the shadows, the constant, unending hum of nothing. It had weight and dimension. You could measure it in the centuries that had passed without a single word spoken back to her. It was the environment, the water she had been drowning in for lifetimes. Prolonged isolation is a documented form of psychological torture. It breaks down the mind's ability to maintain a stable sense of self. Even the most powerful psyches, human or otherwise, crumble under the endless pressure of absolute solitude. The mind turns in on itself, creating phantoms and echoes just to have something to interact with. For a being built on connection, on the exchange of energy and thought, 300 years of silence wasn't just punishment. It was a slow, precise dissection of the soul. It wasn't the cage that was the true punishment. It was the silence inside it. He didn't see a monster anymore. He saw a monument to solitude, a being worn smooth by the endless grinding passage of time alone. Every sharp edge of her power, every defensive posture had been a reaction to that solitude. A shield against the crushing weight of being the only conscious thing in a tomb of her own making. The fierceness wasn't her nature. It was a scar. A callus formed over a deep, unhealed wound. The vulnerability she revealed was the raw, unguarded ache of that solitude. It wasn't something she could fake or perform. It was the truth of her existence laid bare in the quiet moment after the ritual. It transformed her from a predator, a mythical creature to be feared, into a tragic figure. A victim of a punishment so complete it had stolen even her connection to the rest of the universe. Her fierceness had just been a shield for a profound, centuries-deep loneliness. This revelation changed the calculation. It was no longer just a transaction, a simple exchange of his life force for her freedom. It was no longer about escape. It was about understanding the person he was making the deal with. The math of survival got a lot more complicated when you realized the other variable in the equation had a soul. Ethan could have accepted her as a monster. It would have been the simpler story. The easier one, a creature of myth, a vampire alien preying on a stranded human. A clean narrative with clear lines. He pushed himself upright, the emptiness inside him making the motion slow and deliberate. His eyes locked on hers, the voids that absorbed light. "Tell me the truth," he insisted, his voice raw but steady. "Not the story your people carved." "Your story?" It was a direct challenge, a violation of every first contact protocol ever written. He wasn't asking for data or history. He was demanding personal testimony from something that might not even have a self in the way he understood it. He was picking at the threads of a tapestry woven by gods, pulling on a single loose string and risking the entire design unraveling into chaos. If the foundation of her identity was the curse, what happened if you questioned the curse's story? Cognitive dissonance theory explains this impulse perfectly. Faced with a complex and threatening situation, the human mind often prefers a simple, villainous narrative. It's easier to process. It requires less emotional energy. You can hate a monster. You can fight a monster. Understanding a tragic figure, a being with motivations and a history that makes her actions sympathetic. That's messy. That forces you to reconsider your own position, your own safety. It's far less work to just see the fangs in the pale skin and file her under dangerous. Ethan was refusing to do the easy thing. Her truth, when it came, was indeed messier. It wasn't a story of power or rebellion. It was a story of choice. A story of betrayal, and buried deep underneath centuries of solitude and defiance, it was a story about a love for her people so profound that her ultimate act of disobedience was, in its own twisted way, the ultimate act of loyalty. She didn't hate them. She loved their potential, their beauty, their existence, so much that she could not be the instrument of the death that sustained it. Her refusal to sacrifice was not a rejection of her people, but a rejection of the cost they were willing to pay to continue. She chose their ideals over their reality, and for that they buried her. This is why Ethan refused to abandon her even though he knew the path ahead would irrevocably alter him, would cost him pieces of himself he could never get back. He saw past the myth, past the fangs and the ancient power and the prison of stone. He recognized a victim of a grand and cruel narrative. Her own civilization had written her into the role of monster because it was convenient for them. It justified their actions. It simplified their worldview. He looked at her and chose to believe her story over the convenient myth. He chose to see the prisoner, not the jailer. The heretic, not the beast. His choice to stay was no longer about survival. The math of oxygen and escape routes was irrelevant now. It was a choice to side with the accused, to stand with the one who had been condemned by the official record. He was no longer a stranded pilot making a deal. He was taking a side in a war that had ended centuries before he was born. The cold touch of her hand on his arm was no longer a predator's contact. It was an alliance, a pact made in the dim light of a truth they now shared. The tension of their strange partnership shifted from practical necessity to something far more dangerous, mutual understanding. And with that understanding came a new kind of risk. Trust in that place had a temperature. It was cold. They stood at the edge of a deeper darkness, a sloping passage that led down into the asteroid's core. The air felt heavier there, thick with the hum of the prison's engine. He was still shaking from the drain of the first seal, a hollow feeling sitting where his strength used to be. He braced a hand against the cold wall to steady himself. As he did, Solara reached out. Her hand, pale and long-fingered, brushed against his arm. He expected a shock. A jolt of alien energy, or perhaps the same draining cold from the glyph. Instead, it was just cold. A simple, steady chill that seeped through the fabric of his sleeve. Yet strangely, it wasn't unpleasant. It didn't burn or bite. It was the cold of deep space, the absolute zero of the void between stars. It was the temperature of her native element, the environment she was born from, and in that moment she was sharing it with him, not as an attack. As an anchor, a point of stability in the shifting wrongness of the ruins. Her touch was a landscape, a geography of where she came from. Touch is a powerful communicator, one of the most fundamental. It transcends language barriers, even species barriers. You can lie with words. It's harder to lie with a touch. The intention behind it, comfort, threat, connection, is often conveyed more clearly through skin than through speech. A hand on an arm can say more than a dictionary. Her cold fingers against his sleeve didn't carry words. They carried a simple, clear message. A shift in intent. It said, I am here. You are here. We are in this together. It was a signal that bypassed all the complexity of their situation and went straight to the core of the new alliance. That touch was a contract. It finalized the unspoken agreement that had been forming since he chose to hear her story. It sealed the shift from captor and captive, from predator and prey, to partners in a shared, desperate gamble. The tension of their forced alliance, the doubt, the fear, the calculation, resolved in that simple, cold contact. They were no longer two separate entities trying to use each other. They were a single unit facing the same problem. The question was no longer if they would proceed, but how. The silent agreement was made. The path ahead led down, into the absolute heart of the asteroid. Into the chamber where the prison's engine lived. Where the final terrible price for her freedom was waiting to be paid. The cold faded from his arm, but the sense of it remained. A new baseline, a reminder of the pact. He took a breath, the metallic air filling lungs that felt too light, and took the first step into the descending dark. She moved beside him, a steady presence in the gloom. Two figures bound by a choice and a cold, comforting touch, walking into the mouth of the machine. The deeper they went, the less the place felt like ruins. The architecture fell away, replaced by raw, engineered stone that hummed with a low, constant vibration. The walls weren't just carved anymore. They were alive. They throbbed with a faint, captured light that pulsed in time with the hum in the air. The passage opened into a final chamber, and the energy there was so thick it felt like wading through water. This was the nexus, the heart of the machine. Not a room. A convergence point. At the center of the chamber, set into the floor, was the last seal. It was nothing like the others. The previous glyphs had glowed with that hungry light. This one was different. It was a perfect circle of absolute black. A void set into the stone. It didn't reflect light. It consumed it. A hole in reality itself, right there in the floor. A hungry mouth waiting. This wasn't a lock to be picked or a puzzle to be solved. It was the engine's core, the central mechanism that the entire prison was built around. All the other symbols, all the draining conduits, all the captured energy, it all fed into this one point. This was the thing that everything else served. The drain in the bottom of the sink. The final destination for every ounce of life force the prison had ever stolen. You could feel the pull of it from across the room. A subtle, gravitational drag on the soul. The design echoes an ancient human concept found in myths and labyrinths across cultures. The idea that the center doesn't hold a treasure. It holds a truth. A monster. A terrifying power. The entire complex, dangerous journey exists to protect that central, awful thing. You don't walk into the heart of the maze to find a reward. You walk in to meet the Minotaur. This chamber was the end of the labyrinth, and the void in the floor was the beast. Solara stopped a few feet from the edge of the dark circle. For the first time since he'd met her, her calm, collected demeanor cracked. The goddess, the prisoner, the woman, all the masks she wore seemed to slip at once. Her hands, usually so still, clenched at her sides. Her eyes, those light-absorbing voids, were fixed on the emptiness in the stone. Here it was. The thing she had been holding back. The final unvarnished truth of the deal. The terrible reality of the chamber was its function. It wasn't a place of release. It was a place of consumption. The entire system was a funnel, and this void was the spout. The payoff wasn't a secret weapon or a hidden key. The anticipation was for the final demand. The last brutal requirement to break a curse that was, by its very nature, designed to be unbreakable. The nature of the place built the tension for what was coming next. The air didn't just hum. It vibrated with a silent pent-up scream of energy. The void in the floor seemed to deepen as they stood there, as if aware of their presence, ready for the final course. The anticipation wasn't for a reveal. It was for a verdict. The resolution of every choice that had led them to this point, narrowing down to a single, inescapable moment at the edge of that darkness. And the truth was a simple, brutal equation. Solara turned to him. The goddess, the prisoner, the woman, all were present in her eyes. The serene mask of power, the raw ache of loneliness, the flicker of individual will. They all surfaced at once, visible in the dark pools that were her eyes. She didn't look at the void in the floor. She looked only at him. Her voice, when it came, was flat, final. Stripped of all its earlier resonance, it was just sound now, a verdict being read. The curse requires a counter-energy, a life for a life. The mathematics of exile are absolute. There was no room for negotiation in her tone. It was the recitation of a fundamental law of the universe as fixed as gravity. The final seal demands an offering, she continued, the words hanging in the humming air. My life, or yours. She let the statement sit there. No elaboration. No justification. It was the bottom line. The final term in the equation they had been building since he docked his ship. There was no third option. No clever trick, no hidden loophole, no way to cheat the system. The mechanism was too perfect, too brutal in its simplicity. It was the oldest transaction in the universe, the base currency of existence, not parts of a soul, not pieces of memory or energy, all of it. The entire undiluted life force of one of them, a complete transfer, one consciousness extinguished, to fully power the breaking of the curse and liberate the other. Ultimatum games in psychology show a fascinating pattern. When faced with an all-or-nothing choice, a take-it-or-leave-it deal with massive consequences, people rarely act in their pure self-interest. The rational choice is often clear: preserve yourself. But humans, and presumably other sentient beings, are not purely rational. Emotion, fairness, a sense of justice, a sudden bond with the other party, these things warp the decision. The choice becomes about more than survival. It becomes about identity. What kind of person are you at the moment of absolute truth? She had laid out the terms with no pressure, no attempt to sway him. It was the ultimate test, and she was the proctor, waiting to see his answer. She offered him the choice she was never given. Her people had sentenced her. They had carved her fate into stone without consultation, without a trial, without a moment's consideration for her side of the story. They handed down the verdict and built the prison. Now standing before the engine of her captivity, she presented Ethan with the same brutal math, but with one critical difference: agency. The freedom to choose his own sacrifice, to willingly give what was demanded, or to walk away and condemn them both to their separate, lonely ends. It was a gesture of profound respect and a reflection of her own tragedy. The impossible choice was a direct transfer, a metaphysical transaction where one life force would be completely consumed to provide the explosive energy needed to shatter the final bonds of the curse. The prison's core required a specific massive energy signature to overload, the total essence of a sentient being. It wasn't a battle. It was a substitution. One soul for another, her freedom purchased with his death, or his continued existence ensuring her eternal imprisonment. The mechanism was indifferent to which. It only cared that the balance was paid in full. She expected him to flee, to recoil from the edge of that dark circle, to choose the painful, hollowed-out life he had left over certain immediate annihilation, to be in the end exactly what her people believed all humans were: fragile, self-interested creatures concerned only with their own brief moment in the light. She had given him the truth, and she expected that truth to send him running. It was the logical outcome. He surprised her. Ethan looked from the hungry void in the stone to the tragic figure beside it. The black circle promised nothing. Her pale face held everything. The calculation in his head, the one that had been running since he first heard that signal, finally finished. The numbers settled. The answer was clear. His voice came out steadier than he felt. the hollow space inside him giving the words a strange, flat resonance. "I came here of my own choice," he said. The statement was simple, a fact. "I don't know why, but I believe you're worth it." It wasn't a grand speech. It was just the truth, stripped down to its core. It wasn't a declaration of love. That would have been simpler. More dramatic. This was something rarer and infinitely more dangerous. It was a declaration of faith. Raw, unreasoning faith in the stories she had told him. Faith in the truth he had seen in her eyes during that unguarded moment of vulnerability after the first ritual. Faith that the being who had been condemned as a monster was, in fact, worth the ultimate price. He was betting his entire existence, every memory, every possibility of a future, on a feeling, a gut-deep conviction that her freedom mattered more than his continued existence. He was staking his life on a truth that had no evidence, no proof, only the certainty he felt in his own hollowed-out bones. Life or death decisions under extreme duress often work this way. The brain, flooded with stress and facing an impossible horizon, doesn't always run a complex cost-benefit analysis. It often crystallizes around a single core value or belief, a principle, something so fundamental to a person's identity that it overrides the most basic programming of all, the instinct for self-preservation. For some, that value is duty. For others, honor or love. For Ethan, in that moment, it was a belief in basic justice. He had heard her story. He had seen the injustice of her punishment, and he chose to side with the condemned, even if the cost was joining her in that condemnation. The instinct to survive was silenced by a louder, more profound need to make a stand for what he felt was right. Solara, for the first time, seemed truly shaken. Her composure, that ancient, impenetrable calm that had survived centuries of solitude, shattered. It didn't fall away in pieces. It collapsed all at once. Her posture, usually so still and regal, seemed to soften and waver. The dark pools of her eyes held a new emotion, something that looked like pure, unadulterated awe, and right beside it a deep and immediate grief. She had expected calculation from him, self-interest, the predictable response of a mortal creature clinging to its brief life. She had prepared for bargaining, for fear, for rage. She was completely unprepared for this, for a willing, quiet acceptance, for a sacrifice offered without condition. The emotional resolution of his choice was the final step in his character's arc. He had started as a man focused solely on self-preservation, a captain trying to save his own skin. He had become something else entirely, a man who had willingly walked past that instinct, through the fear and the pain and the loss, to arrive at a point of pure altruistic sacrifice. He wasn't dying for a cause or a person he knew. He was dying for an idea, for the idea that she deserved a chance. His arc was complete. The journey from fear to faith. The tension of the moment broke. The decision was made. The terms were accepted. There were no more calculations to run, no more secrets to reveal, no more arguments to be had. The path forward was singular and absolute. There was only one thing left to do, one final action to consummate the vow, speak the word that would complete the circuit and finalize the transaction, to give the engine what it demanded. Solara. He didn't shout it. He breathed it. A key turning in a lock, he spoke her name. Not the title her people gave her, not the label of guardian or monster carved into the stone. Her name, the one she had given him in a moment of raw, unguarded trust. The word was soft in the humming air of the chamber, a fragile sound against the immense pull of the void. It was an intimate offering. The final piece of the transaction, the void in the stone, flared. Not with light, but with a deeper darkness, an absence so complete it felt like a physical force. It didn't move, but it reached for him. A tendril of pure negation lancing out from the center of the circle, fast and silent. It connected with his chest and the unraveling began. It was like being taken apart at the seams. Every memory, every sensation, every spark of life that made him who he was, it all began to pull loose, drawn toward that point of infinite hunger. He felt childhood summers on a planet he'd never see again dissolve into the stream, the feel of his ship's controls under his hands, the taste of real coffee, the ache of the hollow space left by the first seal. It all flowed out of him, a river of self pouring into the void. The power of naming is an archetypal concept found across human cultures. To know the true name of a thing is to have power over it. To speak it is to invoke its essence, to summon its reality. But here the power was reversed. By speaking her true name at the moment of sacrifice, he wasn't claiming power over her. He was giving his power to her. He was invoking his own end, offering his entire identity as the key to her lock. The energy drained from him completely. The last of it, the core spark of consciousness that was Ethan, guttered out like a candle in a vacuum. There was no pain at the end, just a final silent snap of separation, the feeling of a tether cut. This was death, the absolute end of the line. The payoff of the sacrifice was not the destruction of his consciousness, but its transference. The curse's true mechanism, hidden behind the brutal arithmetic of life for a life, was not an engine of annihilation. It was a converter, a bridge. It moved a consciousness from the mortal biological plane to a higher state of existence, a plane of pure, shared energy. It didn't destroy the offering. It translated it. The life force wasn't fuel to be burned. It was a signal to be boosted, a pattern to be uploaded. His sacrifice provided the critical energy spike needed to overload the prison's dimensional lock. But in doing so, it also provided the template for his own transformation. He didn't cease to be. He was reconfigured. But death, as it turned out, was just a door. Consciousness returned. But not in a body. In a concept, he was everywhere and nowhere. The asteroid was gone. The ruins were gone. The hollow sensation in his chest was gone too, replaced by an awareness so vast it had no edges. He floated in a sea of stars, but he was also the sea. He felt the slow spin of distant galaxies as if they were his own limbs, the cold heat of newborn suns like a memory he'd always had. There was no up or down, no inside or out, just a seamless, infinite field of being. Was this the afterlife? Some cosmic limbo where souls went to dissolve? A voice cut through the silence. Her voice, but different. The ancient weariness was gone. The vibration of confinement had vanished. It was clearer now, lighter, unburdened. It didn't come from a direction. It was simply present like the starlight. You saved me, Solara's voice echoed around him, a note in the harmony of the cosmos. But you did not die. You were freed. It felt less like being in a place and more like being part of a fundamental process. A single note in a cosmic song that had been playing since the beginning of time. He wasn't an observer of the universe anymore. He was a participant in its mechanics. The feeling was one of total integration, his individual awareness woven into the fabric of reality itself. He could sense the pull of gravity between worlds not as a force but as a relationship. He could feel time not as a river but as a dimension he could move through. His old body, his old ship, his old life. They felt like a story he'd read once, a character he'd briefly played. Theories about consciousness existing outside the brain often flirt with this idea. A state of pure awareness, unbound by biological limits, connected to a larger field of energy or information. They talk about the mind as a receiver, not a generator, that the brain doesn't produce consciousness but filters it, tuning into a specific, limited frequency of existence. What Ethan experienced was that filter being removed. The dial turned past all the static and noise, locking onto the pure, unfiltered signal. He wasn't a mind in a vat. He was the signal itself. What Solara meant was simple yet impossible to fully grasp from a mortal perspective. His sacrifice had severed his tether to biological limitations. The curse's mechanism didn't destroy his life force. It translated it. It transferred his entire essence, the core pattern of his consciousness, from the mortal plane to the metaphysical one where her true self had always existed. He was freed from the binds of a single fragile body, a linear timeline, a fixed point in space. He was freed from the prison of being merely human. The final seal didn't take his life. It upgraded it. He was like her now, a being of energy and will, existing on a plane where thought and reality were closer than they had ever been in his old world. The prison was never for her body. A physical cage could not hold a being of her nature. The obelisks, the ruins, the asteroid itself, they were just the physical anchor point. The real prison was for her soul. Her consciousness was the thing they had bound and isolated, cut off from the larger energy field she was born from. His sacrifice provided the key by adding his own consciousness to the lock, overloading it with a new harmonic frequency it wasn't designed to contain. He didn't just break her out. He joined her there, his own essence merging with the higher reality that was her true home. Two patterns now, where there had only been one trapped signal before. They were no longer captor and captive. They were partners in a new geometry. Solara's form coalesced from the starlight around them. It wasn't a body of flesh and bone. It was a projection of will and energy, a shape defined by intention rather than anatomy. She held out her hand, and the gesture was no longer the cold touch of a predator. It was an offer, an invitation to a new kind of contact. He could feel her presence not as a separate entity standing across from him, but as a harmonic frequency resonating alongside his own. Their energies were entwined, two distinct patterns woven into the same fabric of existence. The feeling was less like holding hands and more like two notes in a chord, each sustaining the other, creating something larger than the sum of its parts. The connection was immediate and total, a silent communication that flowed faster than thought. Their bond was the curse, rewritten. The prison's mechanism had been repurposed. The same channels that once drained life force to sustain a cage now served as conduits for connection. Where the ancient design once pulled energy away to bind and isolate, it now allowed energy to flow between them, linking and liberating. The siphons had become synapses. The bars of the cage had become the strings of a bridge. The story pivots here, from a narrative about breaking out of a physical prison to one about transcending physical limits altogether. It asks what form a relationship takes when you remove the bodies from the equation. When you're not two people in a place, but two consciousnesses sharing a state of being. The old rules of proximity and touch no longer apply. The connection is the environment. They were free to go anywhere. The universe was no longer a map of places to travel to, of coordinates to plot and distances to cross. It was a field of potentials, a spectrum of frequencies to tune into, realities to perceive, existences to experience. They could ride the solar winds, feel the birth of a nebula from the inside, or simply exist as a silent shared observation of a single electron's path. The concept of anywhere lost its meaning. They were already everywhere. The concept of anything became their new reality. They were limited only by the scope of their combined will. Where do Ethan and Solara find themselves after the curse is broken? In the space between spaces, on the frequency they now shared. They exist in the medium that her people had always accessed through ritual and sacrifice, but now they inhabit it fully, without the need for an intermediary or a cost. They are in the substrate of reality itself, the foundational layer that underpins the physical universe they once knew. They are not in a location. They are in a condition, a state of being that is itself their new home. The choice of what came next was theirs to make, together. The path wasn't laid out before them. They would have to define it with every thought, every shared intention. The freedom was absolute, and the responsibility for shaping it was now theirs alone. They were no longer pieces in someone else's equation. They were the writers of their own. The infinite stretched out before them, not as a void but as a blank canvas. And they held the brush. The past wasn't gone. It was just a lesson now, a single note in their new song. The echoes of the curse, the betrayal, the crushing weight of centuries of loneliness, they remained as memories. But they no longer held power. They were like old scars. You could trace the lines, remember the pain that made them, but they couldn't hurt you anymore. The history was still there, but its grip had been broken. Freedom wasn't the absence of history. It was the new ability to wear that history lightly, like a cloak you could take off if you chose, not chains welded to your bones. They could feel the faint magnetic pull of their old lives, their old worlds, like distant gravity wells exerting a subtle, sentimental tug, the ether's breath drifting in the void, the cold ritual chambers of her people. These were still points on a map, but they were no longer destinations. They were in solar sail now, powered by choice, not by desperation or obligation. The solar winds of this new existence pushed them forward, and they could set their own course. Post-traumatic growth theory describes this kind of transformation. It's the psychological shift that can happen after a profound crisis, when an individual doesn't just recover from trauma, but finds entirely new meaning and strength because of it. The experience fundamentally rewires their perspective, their old priorities, their old fears, their entire understanding of what's possible. It all gets replaced by a new, often radically different worldview. The crisis becomes the catalyst for a level of growth that would have been impossible without it. The pain becomes the price of a wider lens. Their sacrifice hadn't been about loss. It had been about exchange, a trade. They had willingly given up a limited, linear existence, bound by a single body, a single timeline, a single point of view, and in return, they had gained an infinite one. They traded the candle for the starfield, the prison of self for the freedom of connection. The cost was absolute, but so was the return. This shared sacrifice is what forged a bond that transcends mortal existence. By willingly offering up their former lives, by both paying the ultimate price of their old identities, they didn't just break a curse. They performed a metaphysical merger. Their individual essences, released from their biological containers at the same moment and for the same purpose, didn't just mix. They fused on a fundamental level. The energy patterns that defined Ethan and the energy patterns that defined Solara became inextricably woven together, creating a new, shared consciousness. It was a new entity, born from mutual sacrifice that exists beyond the concept of individual mortality. They are no longer two beings working together. They are a single we experiencing the universe, hand in hand, or whatever the energy-based equivalent of that gesture was in their new state. They looked not back at the ruins of what was, but forward into the everything of what could be. The past was a closed book. The future was an empty page, and they held the pen. The infinite stretched out before them, not as a void to be feared, but as a canvas awaiting its first brushstroke. Their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning on a scale they were only starting to comprehend. The story reframes sacrifice not as an end, but a doorway, a trade of the old self for something new. It asks what you'd be willing to give up. Not just things, but the very shape of your soul. What version of you waits on the other side of that choice? Their story ends where most myths begin. Two figures no longer bound by stone or flesh, but by light and will. They step forward not into darkness, but into the infinite, forever entwined not by a curse, but by a choice made in the cold and the quiet.